Hello, everyone. This is the Insert Title Show, and I am your host, Wolf Strife. On this episode, I am going to be talking about Toby Wilkinson's The Nile. This book came out in 2014, and I think that's probably about the time I found out about it. Basically, I remember I think I was walking around Barnes & Noble in their history section, and I just came across this book and saw the cover, and I was blown away. I mean, it's just a gorgeous picture of the Great Pyramid of Giza. And then I noticed the title of the book. It just says The Nile. I was like, wow, I got to check this out. But naturally, I went home, ordered it off of Amazon just to save a few bucks. But yeah, I mean, I love Barnes & Noble. Their sale section is great. I mean, whenever I go to Barnes & Noble, I usually drop $40 or so in their sale section. But for newer books, Amazon is definitely the place to go, in my opinion. But yeah, I really love the cover of this book, and I find that most people who say that you can't judge a book by its cover, I usually think those people are just pretentious assholes. I mean, there have just been so many books that I have read just because the cover was really cool that turned out to be great books. Now, of course, the subject matter, matters. And if the book's cover conveys the subject matter in the correct way, then yeah, it should be a pretty good book then. And you have to remember too, I mean, a lot of work and thought goes into a book's cover. I mean, the publisher knows how important it is to the book's sales. The author knows how important it is. So yeah, a lot of work goes into a book's cover. And like I said, I mean, so many books that I've read were mostly based on the book's cover. Like, the only reason why I started reading Bernard Cornwell books was because one day I was in a Borders before they went out of business, unfortunately. And I was in the fiction section. And I was just looking for a book to read. I mean, it had been a while since I really got into reading, so I was just looking for something interesting. And I came across Bernard Cornwell's The Last Kingdom, and I really thought the cover was kind of cool. And then I looked into the subject matter, and it was Anglo-Saxons versus Vikings. So I was like, hell yeah, let's do it. And now fast forward like, I don't know, 10 years later, I don't even know how many Bernard Cornwell books I've read, maybe like 15 or 20. So yeah, I'm definitely a huge Bernard Cornwell fan now, thanks to the cover of The Last Kingdom. And hell, they even have a TV series on Netflix now about the book series, so that's pretty freaking cool. And you have to think, too, would Conan the Barbarian still be around nowadays if it wasn't for Frank Frazetta's paintings that were used on the cover of the books back in I guess it was like the 1960s and 1970s? I don't know if Conan would still be around. Robert E. Howard wrote these Conan stories back in the 1930s, and they were kind of popular back then, but then they kind of disappeared for a little bit, and then they brought it back in the 1960s with Frank Frazetta's paintings, and it kind of exploded. I mean, it went from books to comics to the Arnold Schwarzenegger movie, Conan the Barbarian, which launched his movie career. So, I mean, covers really do matter. I mean, yeah. Of course, though, it helps if the material is good, too. So, yeah, that definitely matters. I mean, Robert E. Howard was a fantastic writer, and his character Conan was really, really cool. But like any good product, it needs good marketing. And Frank Frazetta's paintings are pretty good marketing, if you ask me. I mean, kids would go into bookstores and gas stations even in the 1960s and take a look at comics and books to read. And then all of a sudden they would come across a Robert E. Howard Conan book with a Frank Frazetta painting on the cover, and they'd be like, holy shit, I'm getting that. So yeah, covers really do matter. Well, that was a bit of a tangent, but trust me, I have plenty to say on Toby Wilkinson's The Nile. So yeah, back to the fucking point of this episode. I was very pleasantly surprised with how good this book was, and it was actually very different from what I thought it was going to be about. I just thought it was going to be a history book on ancient Egypt, but it was also kind of a travel book too, and I've actually never read a travel book before, so that was kind of interesting for me reading that kind of book for the first time. And the book also gives you a kind of a modern insight into what's going on in Egypt, especially post Arab Spring and the toppling of the Mubarak regime. So yeah, there's a lot in this book, and the way Toby Wilkinson writes it is basically he got on a boat in Upper Egypt, and for those of you who might not know, Upper Egypt is actually southern Egypt, and the reason why that is because the Nile, I guess, is one of the few rivers in the world that actually flows from the south to the north. So the ancient Egyptians called southern Egypt Upper Egypt and northern Egypt Lower Egypt. So, but if you're into ancient Egypt, then you probably already know that, but just in case. So Toby Wilkinson actually got a boat in southern Egypt starting in Aswan and basically went down the Nile, hitting all the hot spots along the way until he got to Cairo, and that's where he ended the book. For some weird reason, he did not go to Alexandria, but I mean, it's his book. He can stop his journey whenever he wants to, I guess. And I guess, to be fair, Alexandria was kind of a new addition to ancient Egypt. But yeah, anyway, the way he writes it is very, very interesting. Like, basically, he actually wrote this book on the boat going down the Nile. So the book has a certain flow and ease to it. Like, you can actually almost feel like you're there with him going down the Nile. And he gives a really good description of all the sights, the sounds, the smells, and it's very interesting. I mean, it's almost kind of peaceful, the flow of the book. So yeah, it's pretty interesting. And he also does a really good job explaining things. Like basically with each place he goes to, he goes to Aswan, he goes to Luxor, then he finishes up in Cairo. And each place he goes to, he goes into detail about the history of the place back in ancient Egypt, like all the interesting things that happened there, how the place was built, why it was built. He goes into the monuments, the temples. He goes into detail about what kind of place it was. Was it a military stronghold? Was it a agricultural center? Or was it a administrative center? I mean, he just really goes into detail about each and every place. And then he'll usually talk about what was going on there in the 17 and 1800s, kind of when archaeology and Egyptology was getting going. And then he'll talk about basically what's happened there the last 100 years, so basically the modern era. And unfortunately, the modern era has been kind of rough in Egypt. Like in Aswan, where the book starts off, he talks about, I guess it was back in I can't remember, it was like the early or mid 20th century when they built the Aswan Dam, which for the first time in history gave Egyptians control over the Nile flood. So with that power, they were able to create much more farmland and, naturally they were able to create more food, which increased their population exponentially. And in fact, I think Egypt might be the most populous country in Africa. So yeah, that definitely changed things for Egypt. And though that could be a good thing, people aren't starving in the streets anymore, but the unintended consequences are that now silt can't get into the northern part of the Nile. So now all the farmland north of Aswan is actually starting to die because it's not getting the nutrients from the silt anymore. So that could be a ticking time bomb, and I guess we're going to have to see what happens. But yeah, that could be a big, big disaster on the horizon for Egypt. So yeah, you really do get a full picture here of the past, what kind of got Egyptology going, and then what's going on there now with this book, which is really, really cool. And like I said too, it is kind of like a travel book, so he'll talk about touristy stuff like transportation, hotels, cruise ships, and just all that kind of stuff. And he'll talk about, the food and how the people are there and stuff. So that was fascinating. But he does a really good job telling you about the ancient Egyptian history in these places too. I mean, that stuff was fascinating. Like which pharaoh built this there, which pharaoh did this there, it's just all that kind of stuff. And he doesn't just talk about the ancient Egyptian period. He'll also talk about, what the hell was going on here during the time of Alexander the Great, the Roman Empire, the Byzantines, the early Christians, and then when the Muslims came in and took over, he'll go into full detail about that. And he'll also go into detail about what life was like for the average people back then, too. Like, he'll tell anecdotes that were found on papyrus and pottery, just stories that people wrote down of their everyday life, like tax collectors and merchants and just, regular people back then. So that's really cool and adds a lot to the book. And then for most places, he'll talk about what was going on there, like mainly in the 1800s, like when archaeology and Egyptology was basically being created. He'll talk about, the founding fathers of Egyptology and archaeology, like Jean-Francois Champollion, Flinders Petrie, and of course Howard Carter, and a lot of people I've never heard of before, like a lot of women who really were instrumental in the formation of Egyptology and archaeology as a science. So that was really interesting, and he does a really good job telling their stories too, I think. And unfortunately, he gives a lot of detail about what's been going on there the last 100 years, and a lot of the places have they've had some pretty crazy shit going on. Like at the I guess it was like the palace or the temple of Hatshepsut. Back in 1997, there was a big terrorist attack there. I think it was like 6 terrorists were dressed up as Egyptian police officers, and they whipped out AKs and knives and slaughtered 58 tourists. I mean, it was just really, really bad. Like, they killed a 5-year-old British child and 4 couples from Japan who were there on their honeymoons and stuff. I mean, it was just really, really bad. I don't really know what they were trying to do. I guess they were trying to turn Muslims against Europeans and foreigners and stuff. But actually, because of the drop in tourism, naturally, there was such a huge blowback against the terrorists from the Egyptians because they were like, hey, you're fucking with our bread and butter here. I mean, we kind of survive on tourist dollars, you dickheads. That the terrorists actually kind of had to halt operations, and a lot of them actually left Egypt because of the blowback from that. But yeah, that really stopped tourism in Egypt for a while. And Toby Wilkinson talks about, basically everywhere you go now, like to the monuments and stuff, he talks about how there are a shitload of police officers and military guards and stuff at each one of these places. Yeah, Egypt, they're definitely trying to keep their tourist cash cow alive, so I guess that's kind of a good thing, but still, though, I mean, that'd be kind of creepy going there. Because I actually read about this, I think it was called the Luxor Massacre. I read about it on Wikipedia like 5 or 6 years ago, and I remember just being kind of freaked out about that. Like, imagine going all the way to Egypt and enjoying the beauty and the majesty of ancient Egypt, and then all of a sudden, some dude whips out a gun and starts mowing down, all the people next to you and stuff. I mean, it would just be holy fucking shit. And he also goes into a lot of the kind of crazy shit that's going on around Cairo. Like, he was talking about how in maybe 20 or 30 years, the Great Pyramids of Giza and the Sphinx even might be overtaken by the metropolis of Cairo. Like they might be building shitty apartment complexes and gas stations right next to these peerless monuments. I mean, my God, can you imagine that? Like, there's just so much crazy shit going on in Egypt, especially after the fall of Mubarak, but he was kind of an asshole, so I don't know. Guess I can't really blame the Egyptian people on that one, but God, I wish they valued their ancient Egyptian history more. But maybe, unfortunately, it's one of those things where you don't really know what you have until you don't have it anymore. So, I don't know. I mean, there was that case a couple of years ago, or hell, maybe that was just a year ago, where the guy was cleaning Tutankhamun's mask and he broke the fucking beard off and tried to glue it back on without being caught. I mean, just, oh my God. I mean, if I was the dictator in Egypt, I would have had that guy thrown against the wall and shot for that. I mean, just, God. But I mean, Egypt's kind of a complicated place to say the least. I mean, God, just all the stuff that's happened there over the years. And the government's not helping themselves too much either. Like their antiquities department basically has a rule that if, say, you want to build a house or a gas station or a restaurant somewhere, they basically have to excavate underneath the ground just to make sure there's nothing there. But if they find, artifacts or a tomb or something, then the whole place gets shut down and you're basically screwed. So what's going on now is a lot of builders and contractors and whatnot, if they find anything dealing with ancient Egypt, they just start pouring cement immediately. Just, yeah, because they have to get this building built, so they don't really care about any antiquities they could be destroying in the process. It's just kind of sad, but I mean, you gotta make a living. Oddly enough, it's kind of like what the EPA tried to do over here. Basically, they were like out west mostly. They were having it so that if you had a endangered animal on your property, you couldn't do anything without the government's permission. Like you couldn't build an add-on to your house, you couldn't do anything to the pond, or you just couldn't do anything. So what a lot of people were doing was, if they saw the endangered animal on their property, well, they would just shoot it, grab it, dig a hole, throw it in there, bury it, and just walk away. So yeah, yeah, that doesn't really help anybody. I mean, yeah, both government agencies are kind of helping destroy what they're trying to preserve. So I don't really know what the answer is on either one of those, but it's complicated, man. It's just complicated. But anyway, this is a really, really good book. I just wish that I was actually going to Egypt soon so that I could actually make use of all the information and the tips and all the knowledge that Toby Wilkinson imparted onto me through this book, because I'm afraid that by the time I actually get to go to Egypt, I'm gonna forget all of these tips. And like he talks about a lot of off the beaten paths and places to go and check out, so I'm kind of afraid I'm gonna forget about all of those. So one day when I actually get to go to Egypt, I might have to reread this book again just to get some traveler's tips and stuff. But yeah, if you are at all interested in ancient Egypt, or if you're interested in going to Egypt, then this is definitely a really excellent book for you to check out. I really enjoyed this book. It taught me a hell of a lot about Egypt that I didn't know, and it definitely makes me want to go to Egypt, especially before things start to change for possibly the worse over there. I want to see the pyramids before it's got a gas station next to it and crazy shit like that. But yeah, this really is an excellent book, and I highly recommend it to you. So yeah, definitely if you're curious, check out Toby Wilkinson's The Nile.